And Preet Bharara, the former United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, joins me now. It's good to have you here.
Good to be here.
A real interesting study in contrasts over the last few weeks.
Indeed.
What strikes you about the reaction today?
So when you think about the Biden family and how Joe Biden in particular thinks about his job, but not just his job, about his family, upon the conviction or before the conviction, upon the investigation and arrest and indictment of his son, given what his family has been through, you would think that every fatherly instinct would have been to protect him. If you're a father, I know you are, you love your children more than you love yourself. You try to protect them from harm. You try to protect them from bad consequences. And the Biden family has suffered a lot of bad things as a family. And yet there's some things that are more important than that when you are the commander in chief and you're basically the president of the country. And one of those things is that no one is above the law and the rule of law matters. And here is an occasion, as you've been pointing out in the intro, where Joe Biden had absolute authority, literal authority. He had no authority over Alvin Bragg. He didn't direct the prosecution of Donald Trump. It's his Justice Department. He had authority to direct people not to prosecute his son. He could have fired the special counsel. He could have directed that the special counsel not be appointed in the first place. He could have pardoned his son preemptively. He could still pardon him. He said he won't do that. All of that conduct, given that it's his son, is kind of, we should pause for a moment and think about how unbelievable that is. In a million years, if the shoe were on the other foot and Donald Trump was facing the prospect of his son being prosecuted by a Biden, me, if I had been held over, a Biden holdover or Obama holdover prosecutor, not in a million years would that have happened. So, some of the people on the right, the people who support Donald Trump, are trying to cast this as some clever ops program by which this actually proves that he's trying to get his son up. It's amazing to me.
It's a non-falsifiable. I will say it's outlandish to imagine Don Jr. getting into trouble with guns and drugs. But the Stephen Miller said this: the gun charges are a giant misdirection, an easy op for DOJ to sell to a pliant media that is all too willing to be duped. Don't be gaslit. This is all about protecting Joe Biden, only Joe Biden. So, no matter what happens, right, the corrupt rig system is just deeper than you realize.
Yeah, I replied to that. If every possible outcome, if every possible permutation is arguably a point in your favor, then maybe your position is terrible. And I use a different word than terrible.
I don't even think he was required, even by probity, to keep David Weiss on in Delaware.
No.
I honestly, that is, when I say bend over backwards, that is bending over backwards. It would have been perfectly reasonable.
Bend over backwards, above and beyond.
To replace him. And obviously, it wouldn't be reasonable to say, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, drop the Hunter case. But if you say, hey, do your thing. But he didn't have to do it.
He didn't. And by the way, some other features of this are also important to point out. And you mentioned some of them in the intro. This jury verdict came out. They didn't dox the jury. They didn't attack the judge. He didn't say this is a travesty of justice, this is a witch hunt. He said what people say, what I used to say when I was U.S. attorney for 7.5 years. And from time to time, even though we thought we brought a righteous or meritorious case.
You win some, you lose some.
Yeah, and you say we respect the verdict of the jury. Completely opposite to what Donald Trump did.
It was striking to me, you just mentioned this, one of the most striking things is after that Trump verdict, and I remember Judge Kaplan in that federal civil trial with E. Jean Carroll told the jurors, look, you can talk to the press if you want. I'd advise you not to.
And they didn't.
And they didn't. In Alvin Bragg's case, they did not talk to the press. And I think we all know the reason. They would expose themselves to harassment and possibly threats and possibly violence. Here today, you had the jurors talking to the press, which, again, great. I'm a reporter. I like it. But what a contrast.
No, it's a very stark contrast. And I think it goes to just show that when Joe Biden and his supporters talk about rule of law and nobody being above the law, they mean it. And you can disagree with Joe Biden's policies, and you can talk about the border and all these other things that are not in my bailiwick about politics. But on the question of whether or not the rule of law is to be enforced and there's no fear or favor to be given to anyone, including the son of a sitting president of the United States, the Republicans are full of it on the Trump side, and Biden is not.
He's walked the walk. Final question for you is about independence in the Department of Justice. I mean, we have a post-Nixon order, right? I mean, one of the things about Nixon, right, and the reckoning with Nixon, both at a sort of level of regulation, norms, and statutes, was the Department of Justice can't just be a tool in the hands of the executive to pursue vendetta, to prosecute and punish enemies, to protect friends.
Yeah.
The Trump vision is exactly that, and in fact, explicitly that. I mean, if you read the Russ Vote profile, I mean, they really think we're going to come in and it's going to be like day one, go open an investigation of that person, prosecute that person.
Yeah. That which they have accused everyone else of doing, they are explicitly saying they're going to want to do. There's great irony. You know, with respect to one of the cases pending against Donald Trump, the Mar-a-Lago documents case in federal court in Florida, Donald Trump's team has made a number of motions to dismiss the indictment. One of those is vindictive prosecution, right? There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that Joe Biden or anyone else directed that investigation and that prosecution and that indictment. But by saying the things that they're saying now that you're pointing out, Donald Trump is actually, ironically, laying the foundation for a vindictive prosecution motion to dismiss on the part of all the current people
that is such a good
who
point.
Donald Trump is going to be going after, because he's announcing his plans before election. All of those statements and those plans, Project 2025 and everything else, are going to be chapter and verse in the briefs asking for the dismissal of those indictments.
That's a great point. Preet Bharara, great to have you here. Come
Thanks
back anytime.
Yeah.
So we are faced with an increasingly urgent question. What can be done about this out-of-control court? Well, today, Democrats in the House Oversight Committee held a roundtable on the ethical crisis in the Supreme Court. I should note that one of the expert legal witnesses there was my wife, Kate Shaw. Leading that panel was Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin, the ranking member of the Oversight Committee, and New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the vice-ranking member, and they both join me now. It's good to have you on.
Thanks for having us.
Congressman, I'll start with you just about what the agenda was today to convene this. Obviously, you can't call hearings yourself as a ranking member and not the chair, but what were you trying to do today?
Well, the Oversight Democrats wanted to respond to the national clamor over this crisis of legitimacy at the Supreme Court. And so we analyzed the ethics crisis. We analyzed the political crisis around confirmations that got us into this, and the blockaded confirmations of people like Merrick Garland, who was nominated by President Obama to the court. And then we began to talk about what sorts of things could be done, both in the specific case of Justices Alito and Thomas, and then generally about the ethical collapse at the Supreme Court. It's the highest court in the land with the lowest ethical standards. These are the only governmental officials in the land who are not governed by a binding ethics code. There's no process by which we can hold any of them accountable. And so it violates the essential principle that James Madison identified as the heart of our justice system, which is that no man can be a judge in his own cause. So we began to, explore different avenues of holding them accountable.
Yeah, Congresswoman, you said something towards the end of the hearing, just saying that it just cannot be the case as sort of a constitutional matter, as an almost intuitive common sense matter, that they are not subject to any checks, right? We have three co-equal branches. There's checks and balances that move between the three directions. And the position which Justice Alito has actually taken on the record, he actually said in a Wall Street Journal interview that Congress has no ability to regulate us whatsoever. What should Congress be doing? What are you brainstorming, basically? Like, what's the conversation about what those checks can be?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, Justice Alito's position is laughable in this idea that he can be and that the court should be accountable to nobody, and that the only person that they should be accountable to are themselves. This kind of Scout's promise sort of setup for how we should be having ethics standards for the highest and most consequential court in the land. It is completely unacceptable. And not only is it unacceptable, but to have any one of our co-equal branches be completely unaccountable to the others is paving the path to authoritarianism, tyranny, the abuse of power in the United States, and it is structurally completely unsustainable. And so it is not a question of if Congress has jurisdiction and power over the Supreme Court. It is what power are we going to exercise in order to rein in a fundamentally unaccountable and rogue court. And one of the beautiful things about today's roundtable is that we were able to also call in one of our Senate colleagues, Senator Whitehouse, who has been pursuing extensive investigations into the dark money network that has been exerting influence over the court. And we raised and discussed a varying degree of measures, from term limits to an actual binding ethics standard. And also Congressman Raskin and myself will be introducing forthcoming legislation to even have the Supreme Court be subject to the same $50 gift rule that he and I are subject to as everyone else is as members of Congress.
Yeah, that is a great point. I mean, my understanding, I was talking to my wife, Kate Shaw, about this the other night, who gave testimony today before your hearing, and she pointed out to me that, if I'm not mistaken, that things like, for instance, you can get a book deal as a Supreme Court justice, right? That's allowed, but you couldn't be a partnered Wilmer Hale, right? Like, you clearly, and that's something that Congress passed a statute to say that what you couldn't do, because obviously it'd be nuts to be a Supreme Court justice and have a side gig as a lawyer. Like, we all understand that. Presumably, Congressman Raskin, you can change, Congress can pass statutes that say this activity is just not allowed.
I mean, Congress has a ban on outside employment, and as AOC was saying, we have a $50 gift ban, so none of us goes anywhere near doing that.
And you don't do $500,000 vacations?
Well, I mean, that's
free?
the comical thing. I mean, members of Congress don't even understand that. Under what circumstances would a Supreme Court justice be accepting hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in foreign travel or paid tuition for family members or a recreational vehicle, motor stagecoach? It's just outlandish for us to contemplate. I mean, that's like a jailable offense for people over here. And it's just like the normal business as usual at the Supreme Court that they're collecting millions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of dollars from their so-called friends. And so we need to clean that up. And that's why, we said we're going to start with something simple that the whole country will be able to understand immediately and intuitively. We want a $50 gift ban for U.S. Supreme Court justices. They make $300,000 a year, pay for your own lunch, and pay for your own vacation.
Yeah, that does seem quite clear, Congresswoman, and also has the advantage, again, there's particular issues to deal with the members of this court. But in some ways, the only way to legislate it or for Congress to act is outlaying some broad principles that are equally applicable.
Absolutely. And as all of us as public servants and federal public servants, whether it is both chambers of Congress, whether it is the White House, many of us are subject to the same, if not extremely similar and uniform code of ethics. And the fact that the Supreme Court, which is already unelected, at least for those of us who run for office, we have to rerun for office every 2 years here in the House. For an unelected body of 9 people appointed for life to not have any sort of binding, strict ethics code to which they can not only be held accountable, but which can be enforced is actually ludicrous. And it's almost unbelievable that we are sitting here in the year 2024, over 200 years after the establishment of this country, and that we actually have not addressed this issue. It is something that is long past doing, and it's common sense.
One of the things that we addressed, Chris, was how the private corruption of the justices mirrors the public corruption of justice. And it is this Roberts Court, this right-wing corporate court, which has been dismantling civil rights law, civil liberties, women's right to choose an abortion, labor law, consumer law, you name it. So as they grow more and more removed from the experiences of the way the rest of us live, the more they're willing to just demolish the protections the rest of us need.
There's a bunch of things that happened today outside of the purview of this question of the court, though, do have to do with sort of equal justice under law. And I wonder if both of you would stick around to talk about that. Is that all right?
Love to.
Yeah.
Great. Still with me, Congressman Jamie Raskin and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the ranking and vice-ranking members of the House Oversight Committee. I wanted to ask you today, obviously, the president's son, Hunter Biden, was convicted in federal court on the counts that he was charged with. And I wanted to just read the president's statement and get your reaction, because it was pretty striking, particularly given the last few weeks we've had. The president said, "I will accept the outcome of this case. We'll continue to respect the judicial process as Hunter considers an appeal. Jill and I will always be there for Hunter and the rest of our family with our love and support. Nothing will ever changed that. What did you think of that, Congressman?
I mean, it was very presidential, and he showed in his statement love for his son and love for his country, including the rule of law. I mean, the different reactions between our Republican colleagues and our Democratic colleagues with the Trump verdict and the Hunter Biden verdict, it's just astounding. I mean, nobody on our side said that the fix was in. Nobody said that it was a travesty. Nobody said that the justice system needs to be turned upside down. Everybody accepted it. I mean, Hunter Biden, like Donald Trump, had the right of counsel, which he exercised. He had the presumption of innocence. He had the right to take the stand, which he chose not to do, like Donald Trump chose not to take the stand. And they both had unanimous jury verdicts finding that they were guilty on all counts. So, I'm saying about that what I said about Donald Trump's verdict, which is they have a right to appeal and they can do that under due process. Thank God we've got that in America. And we're going to stand by the rule of law and the system of justice for the same reason that we're fighting for a Supreme Court that restores its integrity and reputation. Right. Because we need to have that kind of confidence, not just at the trial level in federal court or in state court in New York. We need to have it going all the way up. And those Supreme Court justices are just a complete runaway body at this point.
Yeah, speaking of state court in New York, Congresswoman, obviously you represent part of New York. There was a huge amount of sort of insults and vitriol that's been directed at Alvin Bragg, both from Donald Trump on down and all the people that are sort of, carrying water for him. That has now escalated. He's being called by the House Republicans before, I think, the Judiciary Committee and be grilled by House Republicans who have rallied behind Mr. Trump since his conviction last month. GOP lawmakers have perpetuated his false narrative that President Biden ordered his prosecution. What do you think about the fact that that they're now escalating to the point where they will haul Alvin Bragg before Congress?
Well, I mean, what we are seeing here unfold is an outright abuse of power and the politicization of the seats of power that these Republicans hold in order to intimidate the courts and exact political revenge. I mean, we have to just look at this from a basic jurisdictional point of view. Alvin Bragg is not even this is not even a federal case in the same way. We're looking at a state court, and we're looking at municipal and state courts, and we have Republicans who are trying to haul them in. On what grounds exactly? This is not federal court. They do not have jurisdiction over it. This is truly just an attempt at public targeting. And we see that they do this. This is in the model of Donald Trump. It is in the model of invoking and trying to incite as much anger and intimidation in order for them to get the outcomes that they want. And
they're so eager to be servile sycophants to Donald Trump that their political judgment is off, because that's not where the public is. And the public understands with the Hunter Biden verdict and the Donald Trump verdict, the rule of law is just working. And they're intervening, as you say, in a state case in order simply to placate Donald Trump.
Precisely. And what we're also seeing here is the stark contrast between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And in President Biden, we have both, yes, a loving father who is there to be supportive of his son, but also a president who respects rule of law and is willing to accept the outcomes of a case, even if that outcome is not in favor with his family or his personal, outcomes. Whereas you have Donald Trump, who takes and weaponizes the seats of government, the seats of power, and embarks on a campaign of political intimidation in order to wrest and secure outcomes that personally benefit him. And that, at the core, is part of the stakes of our democracy that are before us today. Because once rule of law goes out the window, it is not something that is easy to get back. And it is very much a part of the decision that we have to make before us in the next few months.
Congressman Jamie Raskin, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, thank you for all your time tonight. I really do appreciate it.